You recently saw my take on completed classic fantasy fiction series, and that episode has exploded. A lot of you have watched it. Many of you asked for, Jim, how about science fiction? So, yes, here you go, my take on classic completed science fiction series. Welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where a father and son talk about fantasy, science fiction, and other things we enjoy. Today, just Jim here, a quick take episode with my top 10 list of classic, completed science fiction series. So these are all things that started more than 20 years ago. If you enjoy this episode, hey, maybe even find some things that you'll add to your to be read lists, hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, we hope you will. I believe in truth in advertising, people. While we talk fantasy and science fiction on this show, with a dash of horror and a sprinkling of random zombie apocalypse, fantasy is by far a predominant flavor. That's what I've read the most of. That's what Zach's read the most of. But I do love science fiction as well, and going way back to early reading, science fiction is part of what I was digging into. So I'm happy to talk about some sci-fi today. This episode, though, it took more research. I'm not as savvy and well-read with all the breadth of science fiction that's out there. I wanted to make sure my top 10 truly reflects the top 10 sci-fi that you could be considering from the classic completed series. I think I have a pretty good list. Most of these I've read myself. Just a few I've had people repeatedly bash me with, saying, Jim, these are so good. And they're on my TBR. I haven't read them. Just a few. I'll point those out as we go. But you can learn about things even without reading them. I know Google. Fear not. Again, most of these I have read, and I'm quite familiar with them, and I'm very confident in this top 10 list. As with my fantasy episode for this ilk, completed series are all that's eligible for this top 10 list. Nothing that's out there. We're still waiting for a few more novels to finally get published. They need not apply. We want the ones that are done. The things that are classic sci-fi. Everybody knows they're great, and you can start and you can end and go, yeah, time well spent. Anything on this series, at least its first book, is more than 20 years old, pre-2004. But you're going to find pretty much a lot of this is way pre-2004. You'll see what I mean. Let's get to the list. And we start with number 10. This is a ranked list, so my lowest of the top 10 is one I don't really even like, but I have to admit it's good science fiction. The Book of the New Sun, starting in 1980. This is by Gene Wolfe. 4 books in the original series, and then a 5th book, a coda, an add-on that I enjoyed more than the original 4. So why is it on the list? I really, really didn't like this series. But I cannot deny it is quality literature. It is a prodigious work of the creative mind of Gene Wolfe, and it has some incredibly passionate fans. The kind of fans that literally just want to reread this series again and again and again. They need nothing else. They barely need to breathe as long as they have the Book of the New Sun. It felt like that. They were coming at me going, yes, you're reading it. We know you're going to love it. And I'm like, not so much. These fans, though, and some of you listening to this, you are those fans. You just love rereading this series, plumbing its depths for the hidden knowledge, esoteric information that you'll glean on the 5th reread. And it's there. That's what's crazy about these books. They're so dense. There's so much to them that, yes, you're going to find new things on reread number 5. My problem with the Book of the New Sun is I did not enjoy read number 1 enough to ever want to venture into the reread. So yeah, I'm missing out. I'm never going to touch them. But I sensed there's a lot there. And if I could make myself reread, I'd be going, whoa, Gene Wolfe, dude, whoa. Yeah, and why can I say that? Well, as I went through it the first time, it was obvious he did some considerable world building. He created deep characters, complex, mysterious plot points, and tons of foreshadowing. It's all right there. The meaning beneath the surface of what you see when you first read it, it's super deep. And the vocabulary, I swear I've never read something fiction wise where I had to go to the dictionary so many times because I don't know that word. I've never seen that word. Is that a word? And sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes he'd made up the word. But there were a lot of words that were real. The dude had a huge vocabulary, or he literally wrote with a thesaurus open right next to him all the time. I think it was the vocab thing, though. Man, I felt like I got smarter just holding the book. So where do you begin? If you are brave enough to try the Book of the New Sun, if you want to discover if you're one of the Book of the New Sun types, then begin with 1980's The Shadow of the Torturer. Number 9, The Culture series. Starts in 1987. This is by Scottish author Ian M. Banks, and there are 10 books in this series. Why do I include this? Well, this series is actually still just on my TBR. I mentioned there'd be a few of them. This is the first one. I've had so many of you recommending this, though, and I know you cannot all be wrong that this is some of the best science fiction out there. So I'm trusting you, and I'm putting it on the list, but I can't put it very high because I've yet to read it. Each of the 10 novels, I understand, are a self-contained story happening within the vast Milky Way spanning high-tech space society known as the Culture. It's been around for thousands of years at the time that we come upon it, and they've pretty much solved most of life's woes. Everybody has it easy. It's kind of Star Trek-esque that the basic needs of life, oh, those are there. So now you're just pursuing wants and perhaps seeing how you could improve yourself. As you look at each of the books, you can just read them individually, not really need the other books. It's not like it's building a story all the way through all 10 books. However, as you read an individual book, it is making references to places, events, characters from previous books. It's just not relying on those to tell the current story. That's what I understand. All 10 of these stories flesh out better this amazing society of the Culture, a humanoid and artificial intelligence blend of beings that have come to live in peace and work together for good. And how do you get any kind of interesting story out of that? Well, they have conflicts with other societies because the Culture is not all that's there. It's kind of got it going on, but it's rubbing up against other societies or civilizations that either are a little envious, power hungry, or not as advanced. And the tension that comes from trying to interact and navigate around such situations is part of where we get the books from. And of course, even when everything is wonderful, you have some people within a society who go, but I want that. There's things that still happen. So the Culture. Some rich, fascinating science fiction that I look forward to reading. Where do you begin if you want to try the Culture? 1987's Consider Phoebus. Number 8 is The Gap Cycle by Stephen R. Donaldson. 5 books. The series began in 1990. Why do I have The Gap Cycle on here? Well, Stephen R. Donaldson also appeared on my best completed classic fantasy list with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. So the fact that his bread and butter really has been fantasy over most of his career, but he could pull off a sci-fi series that was gripping enough to have a considerable fan base as well, makes him a crossover dude, and that's worthy of being on this list. It's a fascinating story that has the best of space based science fiction, with people struggling against each other for their own advantage and sometimes just for their own survival. It features darkness, deception, and depravity, but also bravery, daring, and the ability to overcome. It also has some amazing characters, including, of course, Morn, Angus, and Nick. There are others, but those three, the things seem to rotate around. But good luck figuring out which one you should cheer for. These are not cut and dry black and white characters. Sometimes you're going to be cheering with them, sometimes you're going to be cheering against them, although with one of them, yeah, you're pretty much mostly just going to cheer against. I'll let you figure out which one that is. If you want to check this out, where do you begin? The Gap into Conflict, The Real Story, 1990, the shortest of the five. Number 7, the Space Odyssey series, beginning in 1968 by Arthur C. Clarke. 4 books. Why is this on my list? Well, I mean, come on, Arthur C. Clarke. A lot of science fiction fans have heard of him. He became famous in the general culture with 2001's A Space Odyssey. And that's what people think of, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Hal, that robot that goes crazy. Everybody knows about that. Well, here's an interesting thing. That 1968 film, some people think it was an adaptation of this book of the same name by Arthur C. Clarke. That is wrong. Arthur C. Clarke actually co-wrote the script with director Stanley Kubrick for 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then at the same time, he wrote a book of the same title. That's the same story, but better fleshed out. The movie comes out first. A little after that, but in the same year, he publishes the book. The book really enriches the understanding of what you get on the screen. The screen is a cinematic wonder. It's beautiful. It's just a great piece of art. But if you really want to have an understanding of what the heck all this psychedelic stuff you're seeing on the screen is, read the book. So much better. Why did Clarke get involved in this project in the first place? Well, he'd written some short stories starting almost 20 years earlier, literally 1950, the first one, that was source material, the inspiration for what became 2001. But because it's so successful, he goes, I could write some more. And sure enough, he goes on to write 3 sequels. So after 2001: A Space Odyssey, we get 2010, Odyssey 2, 2061, Odyssey 3, and 3001, The Final Odyssey. Clarke had a brilliant mind for science, which he adapts to science fiction. And the narrative he leads you through in these 4 books, it's a trip. The final book came out in 1997, and I came upon the books to read them just after that. So I was able to read all 4 books back to back. And it's an adventure. It's not what you think you're getting when you're reading the first book, but it's quite good. Definitely something I enjoyed the experience of. The first book, not my favorite. You gotta have it, but I enjoyed the other 3 books better than 2001. But where should you begin? Well, maybe you should just watch the movie first if you've never seen it. But I'm not going to say you need the movie. The book is better. It's more comprehensive. You do have to start with the weakest book in the series, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Number 6 on this list, the Mars Trilogy. Started in 1992. This is by Kim Stanley Robinson, and it's one of the series that I have not read yet. I know about it. I've heard information on it. I've had it highly recommended. It's a trilogy followed by a short story collection completely related to the trilogy. This trilogy was published over a 5-year span, and the short story collection came out 3 years after that. It's like, more, yay! Why is it on the list? Well, these books racked up lots of best novel awards. The Hugo, the Nebula, the British Science Fiction Award, and the Locus. And that's not even to include the other awards these books were nominated for. They were highly acclaimed at the time, and they appear to be fully worthy. They focus on the settlement and terraforming of Mars over a span of a couple of centuries, highlighting the best and worst of humanity's impact on a planet and on itself. That's what the best science fiction often does. It's a mirror shining back on what we should see in ourselves as the human race and as a society. So, again, this is one of the ones I haven't yet read, but it's actually quite high on my TBR. I may get to it here still in 2024. Where do you begin if you want to get to it, including before I do? Red Mars, 1992. Number 5 on the list is The Martian Chronicles, a 1950 publication by Ray Bradbury. And yes, this is a cheat. It's just one book. I know these are science fiction series. Hear me out. This one book is made up of 28 separate short stories and vignettes. They just happen to be packaged in one book. But it's a series of stories. You hear me? Why do I put this in here? Again, it's not one cohesive story. Many of these short stories that are in it were published separately first in various magazines, science fiction publications. And then Ray Bradbury goes, wait a second, I've got enough material here. I could publish this all in my own omnibus edition if I just flesh it out a little more. So about half of the stories that appear in the Martian Chronicles were standalones, were out there on their own first. Then he creates a few extra short stories and some vignettes to kind of tie it all into one cohesive flow, because it is published as a chronological collection of stories. Seriously, they do not all have to do with each other. You do not have through characters. You do not have one narrative. They're separate stories. It is a series of stories. Why, though? What's the big deal? Why would I make an exception for this? Well, I particularly need to include this series because these short stories really impressed me as a teenager, as a young reader of science fiction. I was in high school and I stumbled upon these stories sometime in the early 80s. And it was a time I was really digging into as much fantasy and science fiction as I could find. These stories, they just blossomed in my mind. I could see what was happening, the way they were written. I not only could see panoramically this picture, this whole movie unfolding in front of my mind's eye, it also hit me emotionally. I could feel what was going on in these stories. I was fascinated with the struggle, the mystery, but also the tragedy surrounding humanity's colonization of Mars. It had an emotional impact that stuck around. I later, a few years later, watched the 1979 TV miniseries, so on rerun, not live, and it was not bad. It was actually had some decent actors, good production value for the day. It evoked many of the same feelings that I got from some of these stories, but as always, reading was better. So where do you begin if you want to try this out? Well, just pick up a copy of the Martian Chronicles. That's not so hard. The first story is a vignette called Rocket Summer. It's an original story written just for the Martian Chronicles. There is another short story by Ray Bradbury called Rocket Summer back in 1947. It's totally unrelated to the Martian Chronicles. Why he repeated a title, I have no idea. It's kind of trivia. That first one was published in Planet Stories magazine. Again, has nothing to do with Mars or the Martian Chronicles. This short story, it's again really tiny, just kind of sets the stage for everything that is to come. Humorously, this first story, again, the Martian Chronicles written in 1950. This first story starts us out in the far distant time frame of 1999. Classic sci-fi. Okay, number 4 on my list, the Oxford Time Travel Series. Starting in 1992, this is written by Connie Willis. It's a trilogy, sort of. This is the final one on my list that I've not read yet. It's high on my TBR. I'm really looking forward to getting to these. They've been highly recommended, and thus I'm recommending them to you. What's the big deal? Well, written over an 8-year period, these books bring time travel to play in a great way, allowing us to move from the future into the past. But a fascinating part of these books is just the political and legal tension behind the act of time travel. It's like, should we or should we not? Just because we have the ability to do it, is it okay to do it? And are there actually rules we should follow? And whoa, wait a second. In actually traveling through time, there seems to be some natural rules pushing back at them. Like they can't travel to some places. Why is that? And figuring out what's going on is part of what makes these stories fascinating. The first book in the series won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locus Award for Best Novel. The second book won the Hugo and the Locus for Best Novel. And the third one, which is actually 2 volumes, but considered one book, it won all 3 of the awards again. So this really was sweeping up the awards. These things, man, Connie Willis was hitting it out of the park with these books. If you want to try them out, where do you begin? It's The Doomsday Book, 1992. I've got 3 left. Number 3 on my list is the only one to appear on both of my top 10 classic lists, The Dragon Riders of Pern, 1968, and McCaffrey, only the first 11 books of the series. This is the core narrative of The Dragon Riders of Pern. Why? Well, it brilliantly bridges the gap between science fiction and fantasy. This series reads like fantasy, but it is not in any way fantasy. It's 100% science fiction. Anne McCaffrey was a brilliant and successful science fiction author when she comes out with these books. And it suckered some people in going, ooh, dragons. But no, she was staying true to her roots. Not only that, she was dominant in science fiction, again, at a time where most science fiction authors were male. Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, these names. And here's Anne McCaffrey doing her thing and doing it well. She was not the only female science fiction author, but she was a big name, very successful with the Dragon Riders of Pern. But this may not even be her best science fiction that she wrote. Her Acorna series probably should be here instead. But I just love Pern. So I get to make the list. I get to put the Dragon Riders of Pern on it. A cool side note, though, both the Dragon Riders of Pern and the Acorna series are in the same universe, along with a couple other series Anne McCaffrey created. They're all part of the Federated Sentient Planets universe. And not only did Anne McCaffrey slay with all of these books, she also brought in a number of co-authors here and there to help her make these even richer, and some of them more women. Way to go, Anne. Where do you begin with the Dragon Riders of Pern? Well, that's book 1, Dragonflight, 1968. My second highest on this top 10 is the Foundation series. Starting in 1951, this is Isaac Asimov, 7 books. There are a few more books in the Foundation series that come after what he wrote, but I'm only including the 7 that Asimov wrote. The first 3 books came out boom, 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 3 consecutive years, so 51, 52, 53. And then there's a 29-year gap where he's doing other things. He's not writing Foundation because the trilogy was over. But the fans are like, please give us more. And they wore Isaac Asimov down. He starts up again after that gap and writes 4 more books. All told, the series is written over a 42-year span, but with a 29-year chunk in the middle where nothing's happening. That's kind of unique. Foundation itself is a unique story based on the premise of someone who determines how to predict the future pretty accurately just using math. Something called psychohistory. Harry Seldon is the lead voice of psychohistory. Kind of serves as a bit of a mathematical prophet. And he's speaking out using mathematical predictions at a time where there is a galaxy-spanning empire that seems at the top of its power. And he's like, yeah, the sky is falling. We are doomed to completely collapse and have a horrific dark age. Hear me now, or it will be too late. He's this prophet of doom and gloom, all based on math formulas. How do people react? Some treat him like a nutcase. Now, it's not just Harry Seldon. There are other mathematicians who have figured this out with him, and they're like totally on board, and they're trying to spread the gospel of psychohistory, but nobody wants to listen. Some of them are derided as nut jobs, others are persecuted as traitors, as people who are just trying to tear things down. What do you do when that's the case? Well, you know the world's coming to an end. The math proves it. You try to find a way to set things up to preserve humanity in some manner so that that dark age that is absolutely coming, the math is sound, can maybe be a little shorter than otherwise. And maybe humanity can lose a little less than it would and bounce back a little faster. That's all they try to do in the Foundation series. Hot trivia, the Foundation series takes place in the same universe as Asimov's Robot series that he was writing during that 29-year gap. iRobot, heard of that? Same universe. Where do you begin? Well, the first book, Foundation, 1951. Best series, science fiction of all. If you have watched more of our episodes over the time period, you knew where I was going. Dune. The Dune Saga by Frank Herbert, and then finished by Brian Herbert, his son, and Kevin J. Anderson collaborating. The first Dune book comes out in 1965. I am featuring the 14 core books of the series. Why? Well, Dune blew open science fiction with a vastly creative world-building scheme, setting up this whole galaxy of planets and powerhouses and politics and prophecy and even jihad. My goodness. The tale that eventually gets told spans over 13,000 years and is all tied together in an epic way. I mean, the scope of this saga is so impressive. I'm literally left in awe. Frank Herbert wrote the original 6 books, and they are fantastic. And there are purists out there that go, and after that, it just all goes downhill. That's bullcrap. The rest of the saga is amazing as well, leaning heavily onto his notes. Frank Herbert intended to write one more book, but when Brian Herbert's looking at the material left behind and considering what his dad had written, and then he's collaborating with Kevin J. Anderson, they're like, we can't just write the last book. People won't like it. Dad hadn't thought this through enough yet. So they create 3 books that are a far distant past prequel, and then 3 more prequel books that are just like a generation before what we see in Dune, to fill in some holes, to give us some context so that then they can finish the series with us truly understanding what they believe we needed to know. And I've read those prequel books, all 6 of them. They do an amazing job of giving us better context of what Frank Herbert had been laying out. They're incredible. They're fun. I enjoyed what I got out of those books. But then they finally sit down to write the last book, and there's way too much there. They write 2 more books to finish it, Hunters of Doom, and then finally 2007 Sandworms of Dune. And wow. Epic scope, epic saga, epic conclusion. Now, there are more books that come after this, but they are filling in gaps, giving us more color, just giving the fans more of what they wanted from the Dune universe. Sandworms of Dune really concludes it, wraps it up, ties it with a nice red bow, and it's beautiful. Where do you begin if you want to try this? Okay, with the very boring named book, just Dune, 1965. That's my top 10 list. I have one more to throw out to you as an honorable mention, something I haven't read, but I've had people really recommend, especially Glenn, the geeky hippie. He's read a lot of classic sci-fi and more recent sci-fi. I mean, he does much more than I do, and he's been pushing me to read Peter F. Hamilton's The Commonwealth series, and it does look good, so I'm going to give Glenn some props here. It's on my TBR, but I cannot include it on a classic list. I don't know enough about it yet, but more importantly, It starts with a prequel that came out in 2002. So that's far enough back. But then book one comes out in 2004. Not old enough to be classic. Sorry, my friend. Even if I wanted to give it to you, I'm almost like cheating to say, well, the prequel's early enough. Nah, I can't give it to you. But there are 8 books, counting the prequel. One of them's classic. The rest are much more recent. The Commonwealth series ended in 2016. I still am going to check it out, and I thought you might want to too. That's why it gets on here for an honorable mention. There you go. That's where I'll leave you today. Thanks for watching. I hope you got some suggestions that you'll check out in science fiction. All of these are good. Some I can completely vouch for, and a few of them I'm counting on because they're in my TBR coming up soon. Let me know your thoughts. If you have anything to say about the ones I included, if you have ones that I totally didn't mention at all that ought to get a shout out, put them in the comments. I read all of those and respond, but other people check them out too. Spread the joy. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.